let's bring in the Gospels. In comes the Gospels. What we can say is that all of the Gospels were written after the Jerusalem Council. All of the Gospels seem to be Pauline texts. In other words, these writers, or most of them, seem to be proponents of Pauline Christianity. In other words, the Gentile inclusive faction. The author of Matthew, for example, sides with Paul, and he wants to open the doors to Gentiles and not make them become Jews. Then we call him a Pauline Christian. Okay, so we have to keep all that in mind. So here's how this looks in the Gospels. If all this is the way, if this is true, and this is how we can reconstruct the historical record and context, then what does that look like in the Gospels? Well, what I ask my students is, if you were Jewish and you wanted to write a gospel about Jesus, would you make the Romans the villains of the story? Knowing what we know from the previous episode about the relationship between Jews and Romans, after the destruction of the temple, Rome pulled many Jews captive and enslaved them, pulled them out of Israel, took them to Rome. Now, and if you're writing your gospel in the decade after that, the question is then, if you were a Jew and you wanted to write a gospel about Jesus, would you make the Romans the villains of the story? Okay, taking into consideration what we talked about in the last episode, where Jews and Romans developed this relationship, this very hostile relationship that led to the destruction of the temple and the slaughtering of many Jews, and many Jews also taken into slavery into Rome. If you're now living in the Roman Empire after the destruction of the temple, and you're Jewish, and you're writing a gospel about this guy Jesus, would you dare make Rome the villain of the story? The answer is no.
No, no, no. No! No! How about no?
Also to consider is that not only were Jews persecuted through Jewish eyes, they were persecuted by Rome, but Christians were also persecuted by Romans. So in 64, this is before the war broke out, the Jewish-Roman War, in 64, Nero Caesar blamed Christians for a large fire that broke out in Rome. And when this fire broke out, a lot of the Roman citizens were putting pressure or blaming Nero for whatever he was doing. Their criticism was being aimed at him, and so he needed a scapegoat. And so he looked at these obscure Christians, and actually Tacitus or somebody says that they were looked at as this obscure group. He blamed them for this fire. After he blamed them, he ordered that Christians be crucified. Many of them were crucified. Others were torn apart by dogs. Other Christians were put on stakes and lit on fire and used as torches to light the city. Very, very gruesome. Also in the 60s, Paul, Peter, and James were killed, most likely in Rome, and probably by the Romans. So not only were the authors of the Gospels and much of their audiences, they were Jewish, but they were also Christians, followers of Jesus. You would be very, very careful of how you portray Romans in your texts. Okay, so now I'll go through and I'll show you how what this looks like in the texts. Romans and Gentiles, how they are portrayed in the Gospels. So for example, the ruthless monster Pilate becomes a nice guy and an ally. I'll talk again in a later episode about the Pilate situation with Jesus' death, but we know absolutely that Josephus says that Pilate was ruthless, absolutely ruthless. And Philo, our first century Jewish philosopher, said that Pilate had a reputation for being angry, making rash decisions based on his anger. He was vindictive. These are the words that Philo uses. It's clear in Josephus, he's an absolute ruthless monster. He had to be, from his perspective, to keep Jews in line, or he would make Caesar would be very mad at him. But when you get to the Gospels, after the destruction of the temple, he becomes a nice guy and an ally to the Christians. Okay. Also in the Gospel of John, the Jews cry out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of the Roman emperor." Okay, can you imagine a bunch of Jews saying, "We are friends of the Roman emperor, and if you release this man Jesus, you're no friend of the emperor"? I guess it's possible that some Jews, especially the Roman sympathizing priestly establishment, could have been yelling that, but this fits much more a late first century setting. They also yell out in John chapter 19, "We have no king but Caesar." That's kind of odd. In the Gospel of Mark, a Gentile woman seeks out Jesus. It's a Gentile woman who seeks out Jesus in Mark 7. In the Gospel of Matthew, it is the Gentile Magi, 3 wise men, the Gentile Magi who recognized Jesus as King of the Jews. It wasn't Jews in Bethlehem, it was Gentiles that came. That's in the Gospel of Matthew. Also in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus tells a Roman centurion who believes in him, quote, "Truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith." So here in the Gospel of Matthew, again, a Pauline Christian who is favoring a Gentile inclusive group. And so, of course, he's going to say in this text that where Jesus says a Roman centurion who believes in him, he says, "Truly I tell you that no one in Israel, no Jews, no Israelite, no one in Israel have I found such faith." Okay, they're trying to appeal to a Gentile audience. Go back to the Gospel of Mark. After Pilate tries to save Jesus, it's the Roman centurion who recognizes that, quote, "Truly this man was God's son." Again, it's Jews that kill him, but it's Romans who say that it's truly this man is God's son. In the Gospel of Luke, it's the Romans who are forgiven for killing Jesus. This is the famous line, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." This is toward the Romans. Meanwhile, there are various other subgroups of Jews in each gospel, including in Luke, who are being blamed for Jesus' death. Now, I have to just add in a little aside that some ancient manuscripts of Luke omit or they don't include Jesus saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they are doing." But either way, what this shows is that whether it's the gospel of the author of Luke or subsequent, some Christian several decades or even a century later, they're still thinking in terms of we need to pander to Rome. Like, don't make Rome mad. Have our God, our founder of our religion, Jesus, forgive the Romans for doing this. Okay, so they're walking on eggshells, living in the Roman Empire. Also in Mark 10 or Matthew 10, Jesus said, "I am sending you out." He's telling his disciples, "I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. Beware of them, for they will hand you over to the councils and flog you in their synagogues. And you will be dragged before governors and kings because of me, as a testimony to them and the Gentiles." This passage only makes sense after the destruction of the temple, after Christians had come into conflict with other Jewish groups, because here he's calling Jews wolves. You'll be sent among wolves. You'll be dragged into the synagogues. You'll also be pulled into governors and kings, and you'll be flogged and killed. So that had already, by the time Matthew's writing, the author of Matthew's writing this gospel, that had already happened. Jesus died, Paul died, Peter died, James had all been killed. And then that phrase right at the end is, "This will be a testimony to them and the Gentiles." Again, showing a Pauline pro-Gentile text that, this really helps us see how these texts were influenced.